Good morning. Welcome back to our study of Mark chapter 1. Today we will be looking at verses 25 and 26. It says, "But Jesus rebuked him, saying, 'Be silent and come out of him.' And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him." Now, one of the things that's very interesting about this passage is that, as I've mentioned before, exorcisms were not uncommon in the ancient Near East. In fact, uh, they were something that happened a pretty good deal, apparently. But the difference between the exorcists of Jesus' day and Jesus himself is this. Oftentimes, when someone would engage in an exorcism, there would be a struggle, sort of like this back and forth battle between the exorcist and the evil spirit. Actually, very similar to what sometimes you see in Hollywood movies today. This back and forth, this wrestling of man versus demon. And you don't see that with Jesus. There is no struggle. There is simply a victory, uh, which makes sense considering the fact that to begin with, this thing was already afraid of Jesus. And so the idea that he is simply able to say the words, "Be silent and come out of him," and then immediately have the reaction that is there where the spirit just cries out, convulses the man, but leaves, would have been very impressive to those who saw it. And indeed, as we will see tomorrow, it is very impressive to them. But I think the point that we can take from this is that when Jesus deals with the spiritual forces of darkness, there is no real battle. There is the submission of those beings to him because, one, they recognize who he is and they know that they cannot overcome the God who made them. But then, two, they cannot resist the power of his word, the authority that is there behind that commandment. Jesus tells them to go and be quiet. They have to be quiet and they have to go. There is no question. There is no struggle. There is just Jesus taking control, beating the forces of the evil one. And that was something that was very different. And brothers and sisters, again, to me, that is an incredible thing that should encourage us, again, that Jesus has that kind of power. We do not necessarily have that kind of power, but he does. Now, what does this tell us about Hollywood? Well, what we should already know about Hollywood, and that is that most of the time they have no idea what they're talking about. Because again, there's always this struggle and this back and forth, and the way it's presented to us in the scriptures when it comes to Jesus and then also later his own disciples, that's really not what it is. So don't always listen to Hollywood. That's good advice on all kinds of things, but it's definitely good advice on this. And just remember that Christ has the power over the evil one and his forces, and they know it. Now, the other thing, and this is the final thing I'll point out this morning that I think is interesting about this passage, is the fact that Jesus tells this evil spirit to be quiet, to be silent. This is a common thing that occurs within Jesus' ministry when he is confronting evil spirits. They know who he is, and they openly proclaim who he is. And yet Jesus does not seem to want them saying that, telling other people. And what's fascinating is you also see a little bit of this in the book of Acts with Paul and his ministry. There's this particular story where Paul is in Philippi, and there's this young woman who has a spirit that allows her to tell fortunes and whatnot. And she is walking around following Paul, telling people this man is a servant of God. He can tell you the way of salvation and all that kind of stuff. And Paul, in a similar manner to Jesus, eventually gets to the point where he turns around and says to the spirit that is in this woman, come out of her, be quiet, come out of her. And, the question becomes, why is it that Jesus, why is it that his disciples don't want these things? Because they're telling the truth, but why is it that they don't want these things to be saying the truth? And it's a little complicated, but I think what it boils down to is the idea that Satan is the father of lies. However, that doesn't mean that he's incapable of telling the truth, but telling the truth to twist it to his advantage and lead others astray. You actually see him do this when he tempts Jesus in the wilderness in Matthew and Luke, because there Satan actually quotes from the scriptures where God promises to take care of the Messiah, but he's twisting it to tempt Jesus to test God. And I think that's kind of what's going on here. It's this idea that if this thing is telling the truth and people are listening to it when it tells the truth, then there's a good chance they may continue to listen to it even when it's not telling the truth. And this is true for when Jesus does this with this man and other times, and also with Paul, particularly with Paul, because you think about this lady as someone who gives fortunes. And Paul doesn't want the young Christians, the immature Christians of Philippi to then be going to this woman who has this evil spirit because, well, she said this right one time, but what's she going to say the next time? So the thing I think that we can take from this, brothers and sisters, is that whether we're talking about evil spirits or anything else, we should always be very careful where we get our information from, because the evil one is capable of taking the truth, even the truth of God, and twisting it to his own advantage and to our detriment. It is much better to get the truth from the scriptures themselves, from men who are godly and righteous, men who know Christ, than it is to seek it in places where maybe you'll get a little bit of truth, but you may also get some falsehood. So I say that to just say this: beware as you listen to people in the world, and make sure that they're giving you the truth, or they're doing their best to give you the truth. Hope you have a good day.